Motorsport South Africa's Northern Region's Inland Off-Road Championship. A championship consisting of 8 races across 3 provinces with more than 2,250 kilometers of grueling off-road terrain awaiting the eager competitors, all with only one thing in mind: winning, to be crowned champions in various classes and ultimately in the overall categories. All this action will be brought to you by 4x4 Mega World in association with Aura and Propeller Center. The championship for 2019 will be split into 2 categories. One of production vehicles, typically the buckies, single and double cabs, along with the side-by-side vehicles who come out the box ready to race. The production vehicle classes cover vehicles from near standard buckies to the full-blown modified cars similar to those that race at Dakar. The Special Vehicle Championship is for vehicles specifically built for off-road racing. Often the open-wheeler class is what they're referred to. They're categorized in engine capacity, up to 2 litres, up to 4 litres, and of course the big guns, up to 6.3 litres, the big roaring V8s. For the opening round of the championship, Kameel, the 250, was where everyone headed to dust off and get ready for the 2019 season. 45 cars all in all made sure the pits and the DSP were going to be hopping and popping the whole way through the day. Held at the Kameel Lear School in the Northwest Province, right between Delareyville and Stella, everyone knew exactly what they were going to be in for. With no rains in the area in the week prior, the conditions were expected to be bone dry and dusty. The first order of business at the Kameel 250 was a 48-kilometer prologue race. This would be to determine the start positions for the main event later in the afternoon. The afternoon was made up of 2 loops of 125 kilometers. The end of the loop would be familiar, as all drivers will have raced it as part of the prologue, and no doubt would come back from that prologue with a couple of stories with their cars ready to race for 2019. With a bit of lastminute.com preparations going down in the early days of the event and the early days of the 2019 Northern Region Championship Racing Series brought to you by 4x4 Mega World, it was going to be interesting to see who would throw down the biggest 48-kilometer prologue lap to try and taste clear air early on. A lot of teams had done tons of work on their vehicles building up to this event, which started very early in the 2019 season. So the short liaison section that took them out to the start of the prologue, for many, was going to be a glorified shakedown to make sure all the bolts were tight and all the wheels were exactly where they needed to be. Some pre-season nerves were definitely on show as everyone calmly made their way to the beginning of the prologue. Join us after the break to see what went down and who drew first blood.
This week, sports car showstoppers. Small sedans and SUVs. 12 hours around Mount Panorama, Bathurst. And the future of self-driving cars with the Rinspeed Buddy.
For the prologue, there was a lot that everyone had to take in. Many teams had arrived with new vehicles, so this was going to be, again, a stretch of a shakedown. There were new navigators and new driver pairings as well. That was also something that had to be taken into the mix. That, along with a brand new section of track that had been laid out for the opening round of the series. For the E1 class, and coming in as pre-race and pre-category favourites, Andre Gildenhuys and Victor Fincham laid down an absolute stormer of a run in their E1 vehicle to try and run a nice clean line. They reported no problems on the prologue, a pairing and a vehicle that know exactly what is going down. For Dirk Putter and Henny Hutting, no major problems on their Ford, one of the older vehicles in the category, racing in the E-Class. But again, they'd shown some great development throughout the last couple of seasons, and the Q8 Oils Ranger was looking odds-on to go and chase down in the E-Class. For Aki and Jandre Kruger, they've been running top threes and have taken a couple of wins over the last couple of seasons as well, so they know exactly what the fight is about. Keep it clean. No problems reported on the 48-kilometer prologue for them. For Ignace Duplessis and Jean Vermaak, trying to get the most out of the diesel-powered, turboed to the hilt E18. Dips has been working hard on getting the most out of the Isuzus, and they're running good in 2019. A pairing that know how to get it done right is Johan Visser and Suisse Marais, but this time around they had major problems getting lost out of the route and eventually got caught and passed by Frikkie Steyn and Conrad Mentz, meaning that Visser and Marais were going to be way back in the starting order come race time. That was all good news for Steyn and Mentz. For Rudolf de Toy and Ben Sutherland, it was very much a comeback race, having been out of racing for a couple of years. A very good run in the time trial put them in a strong position. In the E-Class, they went second fastest. For Almejada and Engelbrecht in the F7, the F category was going to be a tough ask. A lot of the older vehicles arriving in this category to try and chase down glory on the F class. Another rival in the E's, the E17 this time, of Gerard Duplessis and Donovan Sutherland, had terminal problems in the prologue, coming to a dead stop. And they would hope they could sort out their problems come race time. A tough start. The Drup Civils pairings did eventually get going, but lost a ton of time and would be starting pretty much at the back of the pack, should they make the lineup. For the F category, the F1, and they don't come much older than this, the 1975 Datsun of PM de Villiers and Noppie Jacobs drove a good run and reported no problems in the time trial. They'd be in it to win it, trying to stay ahead of JP Strauss and TJ Hodgman, who were going to be running incredibly strong pace in their older category Nissan. For the open wheelers, Suma Smith was now in the chair with Gabby Costa, and she would go out and open the track for the open wheel category. Classy drive coming in from Suma and Gabby, but not sterling pace. They were very much feeling their way around the first 48 kilometers. It was a hard start to the season for the defending drivers' champion in the D class. The D1 now alongside with navigator Marnie Roux. 20 kilometers into the time trial, the Conrad went through the block. They were out for the event. Francois van der Walt and Gerry Prinsloo in the D33 show incredible pace when they are on it. And now, with the demise of the D1, it looked like the D33 had one hand on the trophy as long as they had a clean prologue, which they did, and took that advantage forward into the main race. Matthias de Toy and James O'Mahony in the D11. The Cruiser would be chasing down to see what they could do against the rest of the Buckies. The Cruiser seeing a lot of development throughout 2017 and 18 and was singing like a purring kitten as it revved out on the 48-kilometer prologue loop. A nice setup on the D11. Regan Austin and Warren Foss in the D16. They've been previous champions, and the Midas Kaya Sands colours were once again out there to take blood and see what they could do in the D category. The D class was going to be a hard battle indeed, with massive numbers coming to play. Dierwald and Anton Nienaber were the second of the cruisers to go out and chase down the numbers in the prologue. And as the track started to get more open, you could see the track was clearing and the times were getting faster and faster as the morning session went on. For Werner Grote and Kelly Victor, the D84, would not see the end of the prologue. And unfortunately, the second of the ex-factory Nissans not making it to the line would not make the main gate. Wayne and Keith Smith in the D22, which showed some sterling pace towards the end of 2018. Were running the all-black colours in their speedies, and the D22 would once again try and trouble the podium going forwards. A relatively clean run in the prologue would set them up mid-pack in the Ds. The engine note, though, was telling us there was going to be a story later on in the day. Behind Kruger and Paul Murray, the D25 were definitely coming in as odds-on favourite in the D category. A brand new facelift on the front of their single-cab Toyota Hilux would see them cutting through the air with the new aero package and trying to take the fastest time in the prologue. The D class were definitely setting us up for one of the closest categories on the day. They were the hometown heroes as well, categorizing this as their home race, and they wanted to take the advantage early on going forward into the rest of the tour. The second of the open wheels in the incredible B category, the B67 of Johan Stein. Not too many open wheelers making the trip up. The first race permeated by the Buckies. The open wheelers would definitely be sucking dust the rest of the Kameel 250. For one of the stars of the 2018 tour, Willem de Tooy alongside a new navvy this time, Kevin Riley. A few mistakes as the pairing started to get comfy with the track, the car, and with each other. They would definitely be a threat going forward, though. De Tooy has shown some blistering pace towards the end of last year, and as soon as the Navigator gets comfortable, we would see some incredible speed coming in from the P17. The pairing from Uppington showing good in the deep sand sections. Gert and Madeleine Steyn would throw down a pretty respectable time to slot inside of the top 35. Just a squeak over 47 minutes put them inside of a top 35 placing come the end of the prologue. They'd be looking to build as the day went on. For many, it was about surviving the prologue, just to make sure you are in the queue for this afternoon's race. Francois Smits alongside Ferdy Petersen, the P18 in the Zarko, would be seeing what they could do. They definitely knew the area well, and you could see that in their attacking form as they went forward as one of the fastest Class Ps coming out of the end of the prologue. For them now, it was all eyes on the 250 kilometers of racing that still remained. Tony and Mike Gavea, the stalwarts of the Northern Regions Championship, once again in the CRT. For the last couple of years, developing their own gearbox, not running the automatic box, and finding a way of putting in a sequential box, making sure they can drop down the gears and get through the box as fast as they can. There would be an odds-on threat to go forward as a win in the Class Ps, but they'd be pushed extremely hard by an extremely talented field lining up for the opening round of the event. In the S2, one of the most experienced drivers on the wheel, Jannie Visser. With Peter Visser, his second son, in the chair. Normally Chris doing the note-taking. This time around, it was Peter to taste the speed and show what Dad can do. This was definitely going to be one of the cars to watch out for to take not only the class victory in Class S, but to trouble the top steps of the overall. A clean and fast run in the prologue set them up nicely. For Frans Odendaal, maybe a little bit too aggressive and going off track early on. Clipping a rock and getting an early race puncher, the P10 would eventually finish, but it would be down on the numbers. For Kobus Fourie and Craig Galvin, the P44 would definitely be a strong player in the P category, starting later in the prologue as well, and benefiting from that slightly clearer run. The P44 would position inside of a top 5 come the end of the prologue. Elsie de Jager, one of the stalwarts again of the series, taking a little bit of a year off last year to develop his machine. Not a bad run through the prologue, and the S87 would be looking simply for a clean run to try and challenge in the S category. Elsie, on his day, can run the big numbers. perhaps a little too aggressive from LC towards the last couple of kilometers. For Pete and Benjamin Kotzer, it was a totally different approach. The S11 easing their way in, knowing that the race would come to them. A modest run in the prologue, but we'd expect to see some blistering pace coming out of them. They prefer the much larger loops, not big fans of the tighter sprint sections. Prologue run was good enough to put them in with a shout of the Class S win. Christine Villiers and Richard Carey running once again the diesel turbo ex-national Ford Ranger. Once again, as long as they can get around the overheating problems that seem to curse them over the last couple of seasons, we will once again see them challenge at least for a top 5 placing in the S777. Then onto the G category, Werner Mostert and Rob Green, the first crew to actually arrive into DSP early on to get the setup done, and they would be chasing down once again a victory in the side-by-side category, now categorized as the G class. The side-by-sides coming in, most of them running in the Can-Am Mavericks, 1000cc of unstoppable power, and once again on the 48-kilometer loop, the G class throwing down some respectable times. Vickers Haasbroek and Jurgen Smith in the G21 showed their pace at the end of the 2018 season and once again would be coming in super strong. The G class, the category showing the biggest growth over the last 2 seasons. Running in production vehicles, because these things come out of the box pretty much ready to race, and they'd be troubling a lot of key players in the rest of the categories, but they would be racing for their own personal honors in the G side-by-side class. Marcus Labuschagne and Neil Putter also tasted victory towards the end of 2018, and they'd be going out firing as hard as they possibly could. What we do find with the Class G cars is that they run near on the same minute as far as the 48-kilometer lap time goes. It would be very close to see who would walk away with this one. Different names coming in this time around, Christo Rose and Tion Swart. Not in the full championship for the last couple of seasons, so they'd be very much easing their way into the prologue to make sure they had it all still to give and save the car, the tyres and the suspension to go into full attack for the second half of the day. That would be the 250 kilometers, 2 loops of 125 Ks still to come. Stefan Van Pletsen and Jaco Pieterse were definitely coming in as the standout favourites as they lined up in the Luke Lesotho Chenoweth. The A3 would definitely be a key player to watch. Stepping off the national stage and into regionals full time, they would set the benchmark with the fastest run time coming in from the 48-kilometer prologue. A big win and a nice way to start their challenge on this new championship. Malcolm, along with son Frans Koch, both used to the speed. Malcolm on the wheel, Frans normally on 2 wheels, this time on the notes, hanging grimly on as the T8 went 5th fastest in the prologue, and that along with them losing almost 2 minutes, getting wrong slotted out on the track. The aggressive driving style of Malcolm brought them back in line and still stood a chance of walking away with a good result at the end of the event. For Jacques Van Tonder and Sammy Reddinghuis, they also came in as pre-event favourites in the Class T production vehicles. Super strong showing put them 2nd fastest in that category, and would definitely see the road to Dakar Ford Ranger as a standout favourite. The Class T's setting us up for one of the closest battles as we went forward into the afternoon's event. For Van Tonder and Reddinghuis, they carried their pace forward that they showed at the end of last season into 2019. Horst Prinsloo and Kenneth Venter picking up at the end of last year an ex-national vehicle and starting to get themselves nice and comfortable as they are now 6 months deep into the vehicle and starting to figure out the best way to get it firing on all cylinders. Still a little bit cautious on the notes, but they too would be a team to watch out for as they build confidence throughout the day. The first of 3 entries for the factory Nissan squad. This time, Van Veek and Rust in the 24/7 Race Fuels entry were looking to get themselves nice and comfortable, very much using the first event of this season and the championship to dust themselves off and get up to speed. It looked like they didn't need any of that though, firing in a top 10 time come the end of this amazingly short and technical and testing 48-kilometer prologue. Skalkberger and Alvin Kutsia had stepped out of open wheels that they'd been on for the last couple of seasons, and for the first time made a showing in the 363 Redline Motorsport Nissan Navara, and a very respectable time as well, putting them inside of a top 10. That meant that they would be 10th wheel off in the afternoon's main event. That is a nice dust-off run for Skalk and Alvin. Ernst Roberts and Rian Kreiling this time. Ernst picking up the vehicle, normally alongside Creevy. This time Rian Kreiling giving his wealth of knowledge. He's been out there for nationals and he's been out to the Dakar. He knows how to fire those notes at the driver to get the best out of them. The 333 went fourth fastest at the end of the prologue, showing that the pace and the synergy inside the cockpit are definitely starting to pay off for the JCP entry of the Nissan Navara. For the Calex entry of Glenn Turon and Malcolm Stewart, even though they lost 26 seconds with a navigational error, they still managed to squeak their way inside of a top 20 overall come the end of the prologue run. That's not a bad run for the Calex boys. They were frustrated at the end of their run, but no doubt they'll be looking for a much better charge come the afternoon's event. Johan Strauss and Alzon Fenter in the T29 were also one of the teams trying to find their way inside of a top 20. They did just that, a top 15 placing at the end of a very tough and hard-working 48-kilometer prologue. The track and the cars, as well as the crews, were starting to feel the heat of the event. At the end of the prologue, everyone was back down into DSP to review what happened and how they would be lining up. This is how it looked going forward into the main event. Stefan van Pletsen would open up the road as he went fastest ahead of Jacques Van Tonder and Sammy Redlinghuis. The two Nissans would chase them down, Van Vaken Rust and Robertson Kreiling. The incredible part of the top 14 cars only covered by 4 minutes, showing how tight the racing was going to be as we went forward into the main event for the afternoon. There was still over 200 kilometers of off-road racing still to come. Join us after the break as we pick up on the racing action from the first round of the Northern Region's Inland Off-Road Championship, brought to you by 4x4 Megaworld.
This time, too many loads, too few drivers.
People don't cut the mustard around here. That's it, they're gone.
The return of an old driver ruffles feathers.
Typical young bloke, wants the glitz and the glamour.
The boss shows how it's done.
It's crucial you get every gear change right. One slip, you could tear a gearbox clean out of this truck.
And goes head to head with a rival trucker.
It's been an absolute perfect day.
Supercars. A world of high-octane, high-tech, high-performance vehicles. And the man who modifies them for the rich and famous is Afzal Khan.
When it comes to style and it comes to design, no request is too crazy. I absolutely love supercars. I'm the master of redesigning how they look.
Khan can make any car look great inside and out.
Yay!
But now he's mentoring a pair of engineers who want a piece of the action, making great cars even better. The boys want to impress Khan by taking cars already engineered to the max and improving their performance, their power, and their looks.
This car needs to look aggressive.
Mr. Khan has given us a golden opportunity.
Welcome back to our coverage of the Kameel 250, the opening round of the Northern Region's Inland Off-Road Championship for 2019, proudly brought to you by 4x4 Megaworld. Okay, the situation is as follows. Everyone has gone through the first prologue and gone and done the fastest run they could on the 48-kilometer loop. Now it gets serious. 2 loops, well over 200 kilometers of racing action still to come, and the first true test of the mettle of the cars, drivers and navigators. Stefan van Pletsen and Jaco Pieterse would open up the racing account and have clear air. A double-edged sword where they would have clear air, but they would also be the first to try and find the route which so often on lap number 1 can cause you to lose a lot of time. The first squad that were in a line to benefit from that were going to be Jacques Van Tonder and Sammy Redlinghuis, but they would no doubt be catching the dust of the open wheeler out front as they closed in on the time. Van Veek and Rust in the first of the factory Nissans would be doing the chase down, closely followed by Roberts and Kraling. The Nissans put themselves in the sweet spot, but the best position had to be Malcolm and Franz Koch. Even though they lost time, the magical number 5th position put them ahead of a gaggle of chasing drivers that were going to be stuck in the early part of the day in each other's dust, trying to find the route and trying to find race positions. DeToy and Riley were setting themselves up as the fastest in the Class Bs, and even they were getting lost in the dust that was getting kicked up by the plethora of powerful vehicles in front of them. Spare a thought though for the G categories. No screens and almost no coverage, so fully exposed on the G-Class side-by-sides. You definitely wanted to be in a bucky if you were covering a qualifying position outside of the top 10. Theron and Stewart took up the charge, chased down by Rose and then Mostert. Mostert not benefiting from a good qualifying run. He would really have to work hard on the day. Stan Viviers and Richard Carey firing once again. A mixture of diesel black smoke and dust out into the fields. As the drivers qualified outside of the top 15, you started seeing bigger gaps. Remember, the top 15 cars covered by just over 4 minutes. The gaps were much bigger outside of the top 15, allowing slightly bigger dust gaps, but they were few and far between as the rest of the 45 car strong lineup headed out to take up the chase down. A lot of drivers late to the queue as well, as they started to do some running repairs coming in from their prologue, finding some problems on the vehicles, and then getting into the lineup queue. For the Krugers and then DeToy and Sutherland, they were separated by less than 2 seconds, meaning they were going to be very tight buddies in the early couple of laps. A lot of drivers choosing to go wide on the lines just to make sure they weren't sucking too much dust early on. For Ignis du Plessis and Jean Vermaak, the Dupes Livels Isuzu would definitely need to breathe clear air, so they were going to be hoping to stay well out of the dust just to keep the temperature of the engine down and make sure that their car could breathe good lungs and get going nice and early on. Putter and Hutting were not so lucky though, as they choked down on the early race dust. Free and Calvin in the P44 would be hoping to just stay out of the early race chaos and just get themselves nice and comfy as they stayed ahead of Johan Stein to try and battle for a nice win in the B category. The open wheelers were definitely going to feel the pace early on, although the rough terrain that was laid out for them on the 125-kilometer loop would possibly play into the hands of the open wheelers with their unlimited suspension travel. The F category, the older buckies with almost zero suspension travel, De Villiers and Jacobs were in for a bumpy day behind the wheel and behind the notes. For Regan Austin and Warren Foss, some problems in their qualifying run would see them start way deep in the field, but they would also be one of the crews that would try and charge their way through the pack to try and make the most of lap number 1 and make up time where they could. Hard on the gearbox though for them, and they would suffer some near-on terminal gearbox problems early in the lap. The same situation would befall Gert Steyn and Madeline Steyn in the F8 as they got closed down early on by Visser and Marais. Strauss and Hodgman, who hadn't thrown down the best run in the F9 in their Nissan on the qualifying run, would also start way deep in the pack, outside of the top 30. But at least they were not in anyone's dust, certainly not in the early kilometers anyway. For many, the gamble of holding something back in the prologue was starting to pay dividends. For Du Plessis and Sutherland, they were hoping for a much better run in their prologue qualifier. They were starting outside of the top 30, causing themselves some major issues for Suma Smith and Gabby Costa, who had to open up the track on the qualifying run. They were also battling to find their pace. They would build up as the day went on, but it looked like a Class P podium may be an outside bet for them. For Wayne and Keith Smith, who came in as Class D favourites, some problems in their qualifying run would see them at the back of the pack, and they'd be biting their fingernails to see if their vehicle would last the race. Frans Odendaal in the P10, recovering from his puncher in the qualifying run. Also just looking for a clean run this time around as he roosted himself into the field. Out onto the loop, and it was clear that it was a good run coming in from Van Pletsen and Pieterse. They had lost time on lap number 1, but not too much. They still recorded the second fastest run time on lap number 1 after 125 kilometers of racing, only getting closed down by a couple of races. That meant on lap number 2, they were going to be able to really improve and maybe pull back a minute to a minute and a half on the rest of the field. Clear air and the best qualifying run in the prologue was definitely paying dividends for the Live Lesotho Chenoweth pairing of Van Pletsen and Pieterse. An experienced pairing and a well-prepped machine, showing that it was definitely going to be an absolute flyer. For Malcolm Koch and Frans Koch, they improved from 5th fastest to go fastest on the opening loop, getting themselves up into 2nd on the road. An absolutely charging run after losing 2 minutes in the prologue, showing why they were one of the pre-event favorites in the Class Ts as well as the overalls. France doing some incredible work on the notes, and Malcolm Koch as aggressive as ever in the single cab Toyota Hilux bakkie. Making those passes early on was super important, as they now had a big gap to close in on the overall race leader, Van Pletsen. Jacques Van Tonder and Sammy Redlinghuis had an incredible run also on lap number 1, as they put themselves into a solid position to try and chase down inside of a top 3 in category and chase down the top 3 overall. The Road to Dakar Ford Ranger in good form, and another crew who rolled the dice and did not pay the price. They had a good qualifying run inside of the top 3, and they remained inside the top 3 at the end of lap number 1. The game from now on was less of a gamble and more of a game of chess. It was about staying online and not making any mistakes. Van Veek and Rust had thrown everything at the prologue and really been rewarded nicely as well. They were doing a similar tactic on lap number 1, praying that they weren't going to pick up any punches. The track was in good shape though, not too many lurkers getting reported by the racers, and meant that you could run some nice outside wide exits and really carry a ton of exit speed out of the corners. Van Veek and Rust were definitely eyeing up a top 5 finish and possibly a win in category. They were going to be pushed hard by teammates as well, and the Redline Motorsport squad fielding 3 very strong entries in the National Invitational category. Willem de Tooy and Kevin Riley had taken their time about getting used to conditions as well as getting used to pairing with each other as a new driver and navigator pairing, but we know the P17 has a knack of just building pace throughout the race and doing a nice job of it as well. Not the best qualifying run, but one of the best runs as far as lap times go at the end of loop number 1. A top 5 placing overall and miles ahead in the Class P battle. That was de Tooy and Riley starting to really sing in their CRT. For Vos Prinsloo and Kenneth Venter, the T41, again a good showing in the qualifying run, but not a stellar run. They knew they were going to hold something back for loop number 1, and they got themselves well up the order as well. Their pace predicted that they were going to be on for a top 5 placing, possibly a top 2 placing in category. The Class T Ford Ranger, an ex-national vehicle, starting to really fit nicely with Prinsloo and Venter. They would finish loop number 1 inside of a top 5 overall, and that would set themselves up very nicely after their decontrol and refuel going forward into the rest of the event. For so many of these crews, it was about getting the job done on loop 1, and then survival kicked in for loop number 2. Vernon Moster and Rob Green, who again had not had the best run on the prologue, really charged up the order in their G2 to set one of the fastest lap times on the first 125 kilometers, and put themselves in the outright favorites battle for the G-Class win. By the end of loop number 1, they'd made more than 10 passes on the loop, and were now climbing inside of the top 10 as they hammered the nail. They would have to refuel and do it all over again. But for now, the G2 was in good shape. G-Class open wheels more prone to punches than the rest of the categories, so it was going to be elbows in for the rest of the day. For Francois van der Walt and Gerry Prinsloo, the D33 were looking at nothing else but nice points on the plate for the D-Class Championship. It was going to be a long and very busy year in 2019, and some super wide lines for the D33 showed that they really meant business as they went into full-out attack. It was looking like the perfect opening lap for Van der Walt and Prinsloo as they were in straight-out race mode out the gate. For Johan Strauss and Alzon Fenter, their first race reading the road books, but it wasn't the road books that was a problem for them. It was a massive problem. 38 kilometers into the second loop, they broke down and were out of the race. Loop 1 was all butter smooth. It was the second round that cost them. Pete and Benjamin Kutzer, in their first event of the season, looked like they'd done some lovely work on the S11. Great prep coming into the event. Nice solid result throughout the prologue and a good run on laps 1 and 2. They did have some problems with the intercooler, but it held on by one single bolt to make it all the way to the finish line. Lap 1 was great. Lap 2 was a very nervous situation for the pairing. For Alcy Diaker in the S87, he'd have expected and hoped for a little bit more. Same situation for Strauss and Hodgman, losing some body panels and some time along the way. Same story for Wayne and Keith Smith, just starting way too far down the order. And then the luckless Teron and Stewart having major problems 30 kilometers into loop 1, losing fuel pressure and then eventually losing 40 minutes along with it as the car stood still. This was not going to be the day for the T110. Join us after the break as we pick up on the final loop and the final bit of racing action for the opening round of the Northern Region's Inland Off-Road Championship, brought to you by 4x4 Mega World.
On the bike show this week, we concentrate on speed with some fast laps on unlikely bikes, and we check out a very cool museum.
The Nürburgring. With a length of more than 20 kilometers, the awe-held racetrack called the Green Hell leads through the Eifel forest. Opened in 1927, the Nürburgring became famous as the most difficult track in the world. Since then, the Eifel roller coaster lures daring racers to compete with it. For more than 4 decades, the track has hosted its own championship, the Endurance Championship Nürburgring, shortened to VLN. Through the years, the VLN has developed, starting from a merger of motorsport clubs and hobby racers into a professional championship for beginners and professionals up to factory teams. And the 2018 season is characterized by full grids and fascinating races. 955 drivers from 35 nations start in the 9 races during the season, and each edition run with an average of 150 GT and touring cars on the grid.
Straight back into the thick of the action as the Dust Devils kick up. It was all out, flat out pace as everyone chased down the final 120 kilometers of the event. Christo Rose and Tion Swart had opened up the road in the G category, but they'd also got stuck in a ton of dust and had to stop and do some running repairs on the G22. They were still in with a shout though of a top 10 placing and a possible second place in the G category. They'd found 2 minutes on lap number 2, as had most of the other vehicles. Everyone finding their way on the route and understanding how and where to push. The times were definitely coming down. Skalkberger and Alfien Kutsia did a great job on the opening lap to put themselves in a position to try and chase down on a top finish. They were still getting used to the power getting laid down by the Redline Motorsport Nissan Navara. They were also trying to chase themselves into a top 10 placing overall. Eventually they would go on to tag around about 14th place, losing some time on each of the loops. A full race time of 4:04, but still good enough for second place in the National Invitationals. Tony and Mike Gavea had climbed the ladder nicely on the opening loop after a poor qualifying put the P51 way down the order, they would eventually climb the ladder up into the top 10. In fact, the magical number 10 was exactly where they were headed. As far as the P-Class goes, though, that would put them 3rd position on the podium. Not a bad run for the comeback kids of Tony and Mike Gavea. The route really opened up as well. What was a very tight ending to the loop of the 48 kilometers opened up to a massive top gear 125 kilometers event. The lap times were coming in strong as well. The opening laps around about the 1:30, 1:34 marker. But the second lap showed improvements of between 2 and 5 minutes at the thick end of the wedge. Kobus Fourie and Craig Galvin were one of the crews that threw in one of their hottest laps on lap number 2, the P44, charging their way up the order into single digits, eventually heading to a top 9. De Deerval and Anton Nienauber in the Donkey, the D27, also having a stellar run, eventually placing inside of the top 20, but second in the Class Ds, just ahead of Theuns de Toy and James O'Mahony. The second loop was definitely the deciding factor of the opening round of the championship. Driver and vehicle fatigue were coming into play, as well as a ton of punches. Stan Viviers and Richard Carey were having a nice run of it in the S777. None of the overheated problems that dogged them over the last couple of seasons. They were going to bring the big dog home once again. For the N1 4x4 propeller center entry of de Toy and Sutherland, second in the E-Class in the qualifying prologue, but come the race, some big problems at the end of loop number 2. 50 Ks before the end, big problems when the front suspension said how's it, and that was the end of the event. They were leading class at the time as well. That's a tough pill to swallow. For Vickers Haasbroek and Jurgen Smith, the G21 were trying to chase down a podium to open up their racing accounts in the G-Class. The ultra-competitive side-by-side class, giving us some of the most aggressive driving across all the categories. The G11 of Labuschagne and Putter, very close to Haasbroek and Jurgens. For Dirk Putter and Henny Hutting in the E4, it was all about surviving the day. The E-Class, very difficult to get the job done, and eventually a top 15 placing, scoring 14th overall, and that would give them a win in E-Class come the end of the day. A great result for the Mad Tracks Q8 Oil squad. For the defending champions in the E1, Andre Geldenhuys on the wheel and Victor Fincham on the notes. It all went well until about 60 kilometers in. An impact from a big rock damaging the steering rack, and from then on, things just got worse and worse. A puncture, an engine misfire, overheating, and then with 50 kilometers to go, the power steering pump seized. And unfortunately, that was it. Similar situation for Johan Steyn, although not as bad. A nice lap number 1, 43 minutes, and then no score on the second loop. A DNF, and one of many riders who did not finish and have the big DNF next to his name come the end of round 1. But it's a long year and a long championship. It can only get better from this point on. For Francois Smit and Ferdy Pieterse out of racing for just over a year, it was a good comeback. 3rd place in the prologue and starting to really find some pace on lap number 1. In fact, gaining in on the Caveas. Pretty much as soon as they caught up to the CRT, a puncher stopped their charge big time. Then power steering problems as they came into the end of the first loop. Power steering problems continued onto lap number 2 and sent them out the back door. They were a DNF to join the long list of retirements on lap number 2 of the opening event of the season. For Marcus Labuschagne and Neil Putter, the G11 charged as hard as they dare to try and get themselves into a position. They were chasing down on Haasbroek and Smith to try and get second position in the side-by-side category. And they missed out by just 5 minutes come the end of play. 3rd place, though, would put a pile of points on the table going forward into the rest of the championship. Things were certainly heating up in the 3rd place dice for the Class E battle. Aki and Jandre Kruger hanging on by the skin of their teeth to third place and picking up that final podium position and the points that came along with it. But right on their wheel, they were getting pushed hard the whole way. It was going to be all about themselves, staying ahead of Frikkie Steyn and Conrad Mentz. The Green Mamba was coming on strong, eventually finishing just over a minute off the third place. And that meant just over a minute off the podium. But once again, the Class E's giving us some of the most even racing across all of the categories. Obviously, them limited with how much suspension work they can do and how much engine tuning they can do to the vehicles. The closest top 4 across all categories was the production vehicle Class E's. With Dirk Putter hanging on to the win alongside Henny Hutting. Second place came down to Johan Visser and Suisse Marais, starting way at the back of the pack and eventually getting themselves up into second place. They made a lot of passes out there, took a lot of risks, rolled the dice and did not pay the price. Got the job done, second place, and in good shape as well, knowing exactly what they have to do for the rest of the season, get a better result on the prologue. And no doubt, Visser and Marais will be the guys to beat in Class E. Incredibly enough, the 1975 Datsun still running strong in Class F for De Villiers and Jacobs. Staying out of trouble is what it's all about in these older category vehicles. Not just that though, the F1 with driver and vehicle alike showing the experience that it takes to win at off-road championship racing inside of a top 25 overall. For the S2, after an opening lap that had a time that put him inside of the top 10 overall, Jannie and Peter Visser lost over 20 minutes on loop number 2, cursed with dust and punches, and having to just live on to survive this one this time. Still though, they were fastest in Class S. With the 1975 Datsun plying the field up front, it was up to Gert and Madeleine Steyn to try and survive in their F8. Entered Toyota. Unfortunately, it was going to be a no finish this time around. The F8 just taking too much of a beating in the early part of the season. They would limp home, but unfortunately it would not be a finish for the Steyns. The D11 of Tion Statoy and James O'Mahony had a rough start to the race. The car wouldn't start and was stuck in the pits for 50 minutes. They had to start from the entire back of the pack, but they still had a lot of open air. They pushed hard to eventually get themselves to challenge for a top 3 placing. This team, out of everyone out there, had one of the roughest day, but they were rewarded with the greatest victory. Third place in category come the end of a tortuous opening event. Join us after the break to see who walked away with the crowning glory in each of the categories.
This time on Toymakers. Business partner Dave Young falls in love with the pristine 1963 Ford Falcon Ranchero. So David Ankin and the Toymakers actually buy it to surprise him. Naturally, they deck it out to the max. But can the team hide a secret this big from one of their fellow Toymakers?
Catch Peter Bruce on Editing Aloud with his panel of editors as they debate their personal views and opinions regarding headlining news affecting the country.
The important thing here, all the corruption, or at least more than half of it, comes with the politicians.
You'd be a fool to invest in a country that would just deny its citizens of internet.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.
For in-depth, critical and honest discussions, catch Editing Aloud on Business Day TV.
Dream cars. Cars of strong emotions. Built with unparalleled passion. A unique sense of style. They are more than just cars. They are a statement of the automotive passion of their drivers.
The first event of the Northern Region's Inland Off-Road Championship for 2019, showing how tough the event at the Kameel 250 as well as the season would be. A lot of attrition rate with a lot of cars falling out on lap number 2. No problems though for our race leaders and race winners, eventually going on to record an incredible flag-to-flag victory and having clear air the whole way through. And that was Van Pletsen and Pieterse. For Van Veek and Rust, they had an incredible run as well to stay up there in the invitational category to get second overall and win out their gate. De Toy and Riley did an incredible drive also to bring it home in third overall and win out in the Class P's, with Van Tonder and Redlinghuis getting the job done in the Class T's just ahead of Prinsloo and Venter. Everyone had survived just about, bringing it home at the end of 250 kilometers of amazing racing. For Markham and Frans Koch losing their brakes and unfortunately picking up a penalty right at the end of the event, but charged home to bring it home inside of a top 3 for the Class T's. Francois van der Walt and Gerry Prinsloo did everything they could to hammer the nail on the D33, with Werner Mostert and Rob Green being rewarded for their incredible push and winning out in the Class G's for the side-by-sides. Pete and Ben Kotzer in the S11 charging their way home. Everyone giving everything they had and whatever the cars had left at the end of the last few kilometers. Fourie and Calvin bringing it home for a great drive in the P44s. Tony and Mike Gabea, another one of the many crews that had to really charge through the field after a dismal showing in the prologue. That meant they were eating dust and having to make a ton of passes out there. Christo Rose and Tion Swart did a great job to try and just stay ahead of Haasbroek and Smith, but it was Haasbroek and Smith that took the advantage by just over 5 minutes to take second place in category. Furness Roberts and Rian Kruiling, they had some major problems out there, but it was all about testing and practice for them, and they brought the Nissan Navara home. Laviskapny and Putter in the G11, finishing just off the box. 4th place in the side-by-sides, with Skalkberger and Alvin Kutsia also suffering some major problems, but still able to qualify and bring it home second in category. Dirk Putter and Henny Hutting doing a great drive, as well as Jannie and Peter Visser. Everyone having plenty of tales and stories to tell come the end of the Kameel 250. Visa and Murray starting almost at the back of the pack, making some incredible charges through the field to once again climb the ladder in the E category. The E's, as I've said before earlier in the show, giving us the closest top 4 across all the categories. The E categories and the F categories showing the most wear and tear and fatigue as they came in after being rattled around for over 250 kilometers of racing in the beautiful Northwest Province. The F1 1975 Datsun of de Villiers and Jacobs still surviving on and winning out in the category. A couple of punches for Duval and Anton Nienaber, but the D27 doing a nice enough job to get the points on the plate at the end of the event. Tias de Toy and James O'Mahony losing bits in the last couple of kilometers of the event, but still charging and still bringing it home. So here's a breakdown of the categories as they came in at the finish. Production Class D's, Francois van der Walt and Gerry Prinsloo winning ahead of the Nienabers, and de Toy and O'Mahony. In Class E's, Putter and Hutting beat out Visser and Murray, with the Krugers picking up the final podium placing. In the Class F's, it was just the Datsun that finished of de Villiers and Jacobs, and in Production Class G's, the side-by-sides, Mostert and Green, with Rose and Swart in second and Haasbroek and Smith in third. In Production Class T, it was the closest finish of the day, just 11 seconds, the victory for Jacques Van Tonder and Sammy Redlinghuis, ahead of Vos Prinsloo, Kenneth Venter, Malcolm Koch and Frans Koch in third. For Production Vehicle Class S, it was Pete and Ben Kotzer ahead of Jannie and Peter Visser. Van Veek and Rust took first honours in the National Invitational, beating out Skalkberger and Alvin Kutsia, with Robertson Kruiling unfortunately DNFing. And in Special Vehicle Class A, it was an outright and category win for Stefan Van Pletsen and Jaco Pieterse.
First place in the Class P's, an emphatic drive coming out of Willem de Toy alongside Kevin Riley. Second place in the category going to Kobus Fourie and Craig Galvin, with Tony Gabea and Mike Gabea doing a nice comeback drive.
For production vehicles overall, it was a great mixture of Class D's, T's and the side-by-sides as well as the S. But it was Van Tonder in the Class T that went to the top of the pile. and in the overall combined, putting everyone together. Van Platsen went fastest. Second fastest, amazingly, was the winning of the Class P's, Willem de Tooy. Jacques van Tonder, winning out in the Class T's, went third fastest, ahead of Prinsloo, Kok and Van der Walt. Werner Mostert was 7th fastest overall, but won out in the Class G's, ahead of Piet Kotze, Kobus Fourie and Tony Gouveia. Rose, Haasbroek, Labuschagne and Putter rounded out the top 14, with everyone added together. So with the inaugural running of the Northern Region's Inland Off-Road Championship for 2019 underway, it also meant the championship chases were underway. Everyone knew at the opening round of the championship and at the first prize giving who they were up against. Now they know who they have to beat for the rest of the season. 7 rounds of the championship season up to come. And 2019 is going to be an absolutely fantastic season for all of the categories. But to open up our racing account with 45 cars in the queue was a very good start to what will no doubt be a tight championship across the board. Congratulations to all of the category winners as well as our overall winners. But remember, the end of the season is a long, long, long way away. Stay in it, keep those cars prepped, and keep on coming and lining up. It's the only chance you get to go and win the race. So with all the crews heading on out, it was back to the workshops to prepare for round 2 of the Championship Racing Series coming up, the Barberspun 250, to be held on the 9th of March. We'll be there to bring you all the action.